Okay, welcome to the afternoon session, to a workshop that is normally a bit more interactive. And today we want to focus on tips and tricks and best practices. And we want to also do it a little bit interactive at the end. So try to remember as much as possible of the tips and tricks. We will have a workflow at the end that needs some makeover. And we have also some KNIME t-shirts. So if you always wanted to get one of those t-shirts, we will have a quiz at the end. So
pay attention.
Pay attention. Okay, let's get started. I'm pretty sure many of you are workflow developers, and many of you developed already a workflow, at least one in the past. And I'm just wondering whether you have been in the situation. So let's say you created your workflow, and now the workflow is ready to be used. The workflow is ready to put into production, maybe share with colleagues. But you have the feeling the workflow is maybe not as fast as expected. Maybe the workflow ended up being quite big and maybe confusing, and you already see the maintenance can become an issue in the future. Maybe you run into some memory issues if you load too much data compared to what your laptop is allowing you to do. And maybe you already start thinking, what happens to my credentials once I share the workflow with my colleague? So you are also having some concerns about the security. And those are the topics we will try to cover today. But let's compare KNIME workflow development to telling a news story. So what are the must-haves of a news story that you should have? So of course, a news story should have a defined goal. A news story should have a clear introduction, and you should try to not be so repetitive and long-winded, so come to the point. And also try not to be too long, maybe not too short, so find the right size. Let's compare this to how to develop a good KNIME workflow based on the must-haves for the news story. So also with a workflow, you should have a well-defined workflow scope, so you should know upfront what you want to do. Also, when it comes to data reading, so when it comes to the introduction, which is like the efficient reading of data at the beginning. Next one would be an appropriate selection of nodes. Right? There are always many different ways to develop a workflow and to come to a certain result. And last but not least, take care and be careful with your computational resources. So with this, let's focus today on, let's call it 3 pillars of a good workflow, which is reusability. So make sure the workflow can be reused even if you move it to another place, maybe to the business hub, maybe if you share it with your colleague. So make sure the workflow can still be used. You don't have to reopen it, adapt the paths, etc. Make sure the workflow is secure. And also, we will talk about efficiency. So try to make the workflow as fast as possible. And with this, Tobias, let's start with reusability.
Thanks, Martyna. Okay, so as Martyna already mentioned, the reusability is all about making sure that your workflow can be used also in a year from now, so that you know what did you do there exactly, and that you can share it with your colleague, and that they can execute it also on their machine, and not only that it runs on your machine there. And one important aspect of that is how you access your data, right? So if you have some data files that you want to use in your workflow, how can you make sure that if you share the workflow with a colleague, that he can also access that data file, right? And to make sure of that, you should avoid using the local file system, because the path on the local file system of your colleague's machine might be different than the path on your machine, right? And one of the ways to do that in KNIME is to use relative paths. So we have different ways of using relative paths relative to a workflow or relative to a space on the KNIME hub and so on. So use these relative paths in order to make sure that your workflow can still access the data file if it's moved somewhere else. And there's one special relative path, which is the workflow data area, for example. And this is a data folder within the workflow itself. And if you store data there, then you can move the workflow somewhere else, and the data moves with the workflow also. And another way to make your workflow as flexible as possible is using configuration and configuration and widget nodes, which allow you to parameterize your workflow. And one of the very important ones is, for example, the credential configuration and widget node. And I will come to that then in the security section later, for example. Okay. And then how can you access files from practically anywhere in KNIME? So we have two concepts there. One is this convenient file systems, and I already talked about the relative to file systems, so they are part of this convenient file system section, but there you can also have local files, for example, or special KNIME file systems like mount points or spaces on the KNIME hub, for example. And then the other type is the connected file systems, which allow you to reach out to remote file systems, mostly on the cloud or on-premise. And in order to use them, you need to use a dedicated connector node. And then you can use the output of the connector node in the corresponding file handling node, like an Excel reader, for example, via this dynamic input port, which is now with the new modern UI much easier. You just drag and drop the connection onto the plus sign of the Excel reader, and then they are connected, and it can read from SharePoint or S3 or wherever you have your file located then. Yep. And what's also nice about the file handling framework is that it's also flexible. So you can mix and match within your workflow, local file systems, remote file systems, cloud file systems, on-premise file systems, and so on. And when you use these connector nodes, it's also very easy to move from one cloud vendor, for example, to another one. As long as the file path stays the same, you only need to exchange the connector node in the beginning by dragging and dropping the new node on the existing one. And then out of a sudden, the workflow is not running on S3, on Amazon, for example, but on blob storage on Azure, for example. Okay, so much about the file handling and the file access. Okay. And then another very important aspect is documentation, right? I mean, if I look at some workflows that I have done a year ago, if I wouldn't have documented it, well, I have some, I guess, I have to admit, that are not documented, and then I'm not very happy about myself, because I think like, okay, what did I do in the section, or why did I choose this particular setting in the workflow? And KNIME provides you a really nice way to do that. I mean, the workflow itself is already visual, right? So you have all of the nodes, you have the connection, you know exactly where the data goes. And you can have a look at each of the intermediate steps, but still making it easier is, or more visual is then adding annotations and using node descriptions, for example, so that you know exactly, okay, what this part of the workflow is doing, and you can also arrange the node in a certain way to make sure that the user knows, okay, this part is doing only the transformation, this is the learning, and this is the writing out the model, for example. And another way to do that also is using components. So components help you to group building blocks that belong together in one workflow. And so that's one way to group and structure your workflow, but they also allow you to reuse that particular process that you have created within your workflow. And it's very easy to create a component. If you haven't done so, please do it, try it out. It's very easy. You don't need any coding, like in some other tools, for example. It's all visual. So you simply drag and drop a rectangle around the nodes that you want to create or wrap into a component. Then you right mouse click on it and say create component, and then all of the nodes then reside within this little component. And to make it even more reusable, you can then use these configuration nodes, for example, to expose certain parameters, like in this example here. That doesn't work, the pointer. No, never mind. But in this example, where you can then choose the write to table into Excel or CSV, for example, that's this little green configuration node there that you use there. And if a user if you share that component with another user, it just behaves like a normal node with documentation and nice node dialog. Why should you use components in your organization? Other benefits is that you can use them for standardization, especially if you have then a lot of different databases in your company, for example, and you need to do some pre-configuration in the database connector node. So it's not only username and password, but maybe you need to set some special JDBC parameters or connection parameters and so on. Then it's very useful to have a component that just encapsulates the database connector node, for example, or if it's Oracle, SQL Server, or whatever. And then you share this component via the KNIME Hub or the KNIME server with all your colleagues. And as soon as something changes there, then you only need to update that shared component, and all of your colleagues then benefit from these changes, and they can then connect to the database, even if something has changed there. And you can do that also for other tasks, like standard ETL processes for cleaning up certain things that you always want to make sure that if you work with a customer ID, it always has the same format and all these kind of things. So that's very easy to do that via components and then share this business logic then with all of your colleagues there. And another nice way is if you have only one component that is used by everybody, then you can make sure by testing this component to make sure that it always produces the right result and you do some quality control there, right? And last but not least, then the workflow organization. You can have components within components, so you can have small building blocks that build on top of other building blocks then. So it's really modular and flexible to use there. Okay, so that is an example of a hard to reuse workflow. It's really small, but still there are some errors here or mistakes. I don't know if you spot them right away, but later on, we will see if you pay attention. So here are some things. So the first thing I notice is that there are poorly documented nodes. Basically, there is no documentation. Node 1 and 3 or whatever, I mean, that doesn't tell me anything, right? Then we have repeated manual steps. So I've copied the rule engine node. Even so, the content is the same because it reacts to this Boolean configuration node. It's the same logic twice. So if I refactor that workflow, then it looks like this. So it's much nicer now. I have really nice documented processes. So everybody, even if I send that to a colleague like Martyna, then she would know, okay, he is really reading some invoices there and doing some processing with the invoices. And then I have created one component. So this component is the same one. And this contains the same logic. And via this Boolean configuration that I had in there, it behaves differently. Once it analyzes then invalid invoices, and one that's working with valid invoices then, for example. And the last one is that I use a relative path, so that if Martyna is executing it, then the file ends up on her local hard disk, for example, next to the workflow, and not trying to write to C user Tobias Koetter or something like this, which I guess you won't find on your local machine, I hope. Okay, yeah, and with that, efficiency, over to Martyna.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it was quite interesting, especially with the components, right? We saw already yesterday and today people using components already. So very good. People already applying the tips and tricks that we present today. Okay, everyone wants to have a fast workflow, right? So when it comes to efficiency, everyone tries to make the workflows that you create like as fast as possible. So let's have a look if there are some things that you can do to speed up your workflows a little bit. I will focus a little bit on data reading again, so data access, so whether we could do some improvement when we read our data. Also when it comes to working with databases, so there are also some tips and tricks that you could do. And workflow design. When it comes to workflow design, there's always different ways to create a workflow. Some are faster, some are less. So let's get started with efficient reading of files. And here I have 3 examples. Something that you should maybe take into account when reading a data set. Make sure that you remove columns that you don't need at the very beginning. And if you look into our different readers that we have, the CSV reader, the Excel reader, for example, the file reader, they all have this transformation tab in the configuration. And there you can already select or unselect columns that you simply don't need. Maybe they are empty, there are some missing values, maybe they have some constant values that you don't want to keep. You simply don't need them, right? So just remove it directly at the beginning. This not only saves you some memory, but also saves you some additional notes, because then you don't have to use the column filter at the end when you finally decide not to take the data. But also you can here rename your columns already. So you would even save a second note if you plan to rename some of those columns. Another example would be to read the same file, try to avoid reading same file multiple times. And I feel guilty here. I was doing this for quite a while. I want to have clean workflows. And when I have like a workflow with 10 notes, and I start reading something in the beginning, and then I have this long spaghettis that go until the end. So I was just copy-pasting the CSV reader and reusing it at the end. Of course, if you are reading big files, this takes time. This takes time to load. This takes up some space. So try to avoid this as well. Also, a last tip, if you are reading several files that have the same structure, maybe you have some report data that is created every day, and you now have 5 different days that you want to read in, and that you are using the CSV reader 5 times. So this is something that you can avoid if you use the files in folders functionality from the reader node. There you can also have different filter options that allow you to filter for certain dates, for example, according to certain rules. Databases. When it comes to databases, we have also several tips and tricks that might speed up your workflow a little bit and make it a bit more efficient. So let's get started. For those of you that create workflows already for many years and you have running workflows, you have workflows in production that are running, so you most likely don't want to touch them, but there would be a good reason to do it. Very often we still see the old database legacy nodes. So for some time ago, we have rewritten, mainly Tobias.
Long time ago.
And now we would really recommend to switch to the DB nodes. Like from December last year, you are even not able to see the old database nodes in the node repository, right? They are deprecated. But if you have those nodes in your workflows, they are still visible, they are still working. Therefore, we would really recommend to change to the DB nodes. And if you open a workflow of legacy nodes, you get even a notification whether you would to migrate, right, to the new database extension, and there is a so-called migration tool.
Yeah, which replaces then the legacy or now deprecated node with the new version, and also tries to copy as much of the settings as possible and adjusts it. So that saves you quite some time to migrate from the old to the new database framework. Yeah.
Another one would be to try to avoid using DB connections nodes multiple times. Same like with the reading files, the same file multiple times in a workflow. We would also recommend this for the database nodes, unless you really need to open parallel connections if you want to speed up the execution of parallel branches. Of course, there are some prerequisites, right? You need to have the right machine for this to do parallel execution, but this would be also one recommendation. When it comes to those manipulation nodes from the database extension, what we often see and what we would recommend is to try to use the typical KNIME or like the native KNIME manipulation nodes, like you can see here, after the DB reader node. Try to use those nodes already before, because as long as you are on the database nodes, you are doing the processing on the database level, not on your laptop. Right? In this case, you can first you might be faster with those nodes, and also you save some memory. And maybe if you want to filter some data while loading the whole data into KNIME Analytics Platform, if you want to filter those data afterwards anyway. So this would be a tip.
And maybe one thing, don't be scared. So you don't need to write any SQL code or anything. They have usually the same UI like the standard KNIME manipulation nodes. So they will take care of writing the SQL, and you just reduce the data that is sent then from the database to your KNIME instance, saving time and money also sometimes.
Yeah. So the configuration dialog looks exactly the same. Oh, like 99%.
Very similar.
Very similar. Yep. And last but not least, whenever you are done with your database queries, like after the DB reader maybe, close the connection. Use the DB connection closer node to close the connection at the end.
Maybe one remark there, so with the next version of KNIME, we will have also for the lazy people, we have also an option in the database connector node where you can set then a timeout so that KNIME will automatically close the connection if you don't use it for a certain amount of time. Then that was also requested from some customers or users. Yeah.
So let's have a look at an inefficient database workflow. Here you can see there are several connectors used. Right, so there's the SQL connector connecting to, let's say, to the same database. You see on the top, there's some maybe old leftovers with a legacy node, and also the manipulation nodes are coming after the reader nodes. So there is a group by that could have been done before, same for the row filter. And here we have the legacy nodes. And another thing that maybe you already see, we read the data into KNIME, we filter the data, and then we write it to the database. We could have done this already much earlier, right, before even loading the data into the database, into the analytics platform. And this is how it could look like as a efficient database workflow. So we have only one connector at the beginning. We select some tables. Then we use the database manipulation nodes. And then you see there is a node called DB connection table writer that you can already use before the DB reader node. So before you even read the data into the analytics platform. Maybe it's not needed, right? Maybe you are just doing some calculations and want to write the data into the database directly. So why loading the data into the analytics platform before? So we have only one connector. Just to summarize, we have the closing connection at the end. We have the DB and like the DB manipulation nodes. And there is the DB connection table writer. Okay, when it comes to workflow design, I have a story here. Some time ago, I was working on a project together with Bernd. And there was a task, there was Michael having a vision how a demo workflow that he wanted to present should look like. So I was working on one piece of that workflow, and it took me some time. It was a tricky one, and I finally was very proud having a workflow working. And then showing this to Bernd was like, you know, you could have used 2 nodes for this. I had 8. Not that much, right? But still, there are always really different ways, and like 2 nodes are probably much faster than 8. So I went back and learned something new. And this is also a recommendation that I could give, like, to, if you are working in a team, do workflow reviews, because you really can learn a lot from your colleagues when it comes to workflow design. So let me give you a few examples. Not every manipulation operation in your workflow might be equally expensive. We tend to use nodes that we know quite well, like the joiner node. Might be you want to join only one column of 2 big tables, and you are taking the 2 big tables, and at the end you just want to create a lookup table. Therefore, why not using something like the cell replacer node instead, which is much faster and much more efficient than a long joining procedure. When it comes to loops, use loops only when absolutely needed. Right? In the past, I was using the loop to read files in a loop. Now we have these files in folder that we can do one together, right? But in the past, I was using loops for this, although it's really, there are different ways to do it. Another one, when it comes to saving memory as well, and if you save some memory, your workflow becomes faster because it's loading faster. Strings occupy more space in memory than integers. And if you read a data set and by default everything is a string, make sure that you change columns that have only integers, only numbers, into the right type. Also, if you have some columns that have many constant values, for example, and you don't need that data sets because the constant values are not very meaningful, you could also, of course, remove those columns. And also remove redundant data early. So if you plan to filter duplicates at some point because you don't want to have redundant data, try to do it before you join the data, not after, right? Because of course you have 2 more nodes, yes, but then the joining procedure will be much faster. A few things that you absolutely should avoid if you want, especially if you want to put a workflow into production and upload this to the business hub and share with colleagues. You should remove, once you are done with the workflow, any kind of unconnected nodes, meta nodes components that you maybe just use to create a backup in case you break something here, you still have a piece of the workflow that you are working on hidden in the meta node. This can cause issues once you upload this workflow to the business hub, for example, and try to execute this. Same for the example here with the data transformation component. Once you upload this, maybe your CSV writer is already done, but this is still calculating, and you are not using the data here at the end. So why keeping it? And last but not least, if you are reading some data into workflows, maybe you read some data for testing, right, before you connect to the final, to the database, also remove this at the end. So don't keep those leftovers for the future. This will cause some traffic in your workflow. Okay, another recommendation, and this is really one of my favorites. When you create workflows in KNIME and execute a workflow, you have the node is waiting until it gets the results from the previous node, right? And then once the node is done, the data goes to the next workflow, to the next node and the next one. There is a way to speed this up a little bit. There is something called streaming. And with streaming, you can simply put your nodes into a component. And with this, what streaming does is it sends chunks of your already calculated data to the next node. You can decide for the chunk size depending on the data size, right? So you can really adapt this yourself. And then, of course, the math formula node, like here in the example, can start the calculation already before the data generator even finished, and so on and so forth, right? And this is something that you can do if you put those nodes that you want to stream into a component. And then if you go to the configuration on the top right, you see there is the job manager selection. And in this job manager selection, there is a drop-down menu where you can simply select simple streaming. If you don't see it there, you need to install an extension, just saying. If you open this and look for this and you don't see it, just install the extension. Okay. Maybe last comment before we go to the next one. Mm-hmm. Not all nodes are streamable. There are nodes like the group by node, just saying right before you wonder that the streaming stops at some point. We get the question quite often, can you not make all nodes streamable? No. If you want to calculate a mean value, for example, and for the mean value, you need the whole data set. So we cannot start calculating the mean value from chunks. So this is the main reason why not all nodes can be streamable.
Yeah. But you will see that also on the little node icon there. So you have these green arrows. So if they are there, all good. And if there is a red cross, then you see, okay, that's a node that's not streamable.
The component will still work?
Yeah, of course, though it will still run. But then at this point, the streaming will stop then, basically.
Yep. Another one? Okay. So let me introduce the timer node. If you haven't seen the node before, it's a node that allows you to keep track of your success. So if you want to adapt some of the tips and tricks that we provide today and see whether it really makes sense or is working, make a copy of your workflow, make the changes, adapt the changes, and then add the timer node to the new node, to the new workflow. And then you can see with this nice table which nodes take how much time. Maybe you need to change something in the node configuration to speed up those nodes, those particular nodes. Maybe you will find out about, I don't know, connection issues when you are working with some database nodes that connect to a database, right? So this is a good way to really prove whether you are faster after doing some improvements.
Yeah, and maybe one comment, one nice thing is also you will see then immediately which part is really taking up most of the time, and you can focus on that instead of trying to optimize something that's really already fast, but you think it's too complex or it takes too long. So you know where to focus on them. Yeah.
Last but not least, let's call it divide and conquer. This makes sense if you have big workflows with maybe many parallel branches in this workflow. So to make the maintenance maybe easier, you could split this workflow into modular workflows and then have a master workflow that calls all the other workflows. So do some kind of workflow orchestration. Not going into too many details right now, but there are some nodes that allow you to call other workflows, and this, of course, could make the maintenance easier. So it's really a think of what you prefer as a workflow developer, if you like it, and then also every workflow, every single little workflow would perform a particular task. It's easier to maintain, to be maintained. It's maybe easier to be tested, and also if you have like let's summarize it like this. Many small workflows are maybe loading faster than one big workflow, right? So this would be maybe a good reason to split the workflows. Okay, let's have a look at an inefficient workflow design. So you see here there are some unnecessary branches, even documented as old, right? So we have it here on the top, and then on the bottom, even machine learning, right? So don't calculate any machine learning models if you don't plan to use them. Then there is also some backup meta node included. We are reading some files several times. Of course, here, right, it would be easy to connect from the beginning. It's just a small example, but I know that big workflows that go into production are much bigger. So of course, the connection would be bigger, and we really tend to loading files several times. And this is how it could look like once we clean this up. Better, right? Much better. Maybe now we could add some streaming into the components, whether it makes sense. So we see now we are reading the files only once at the beginning. Oh, that was too fast. The branches are removed, right? And we have some simple documentation, although I think there is space for improvements. The component could get some more documentation at the bottom as well. And with this, you created a workflow where you added maybe some credentials. And with credentials, we are already with security. Tobias, what can we do to make our workflow secure?
Yes. Okay, let's talk a bit about security, even though it's boring most of the time, but it's important to get to your data, and sometimes it's really locked down. And so you need to use credentials to get to that one. So how would you use credentials in KNIME? Finally. Okay, so one important thing is don't use passwords in plain text anywhere if you can avoid that. I know there are some users that use then plain text files where they have then configuration or passwords in there, but try to avoid that because everybody who has access to that file or to a workflow where the password is in plain text knows then the password and can use that somewhere else or in another system to connect to that system then. Yeah, and also try to avoid saving your passwords in the workflow, even though they are encrypted. But if somebody else gets the workflow, then he can execute the connector node and change the workflow and delete something in your name then, right? So that's not what you want usually. There's even a setting in KNIME, which is pretty nice hidden, I guess. But you can set that, and that's even then forces KNIME so that it doesn't save any passwords. Even if you enter them in the node dialog, then it's not saved in the workflow file. So if you set that, then you can be very sure that there is no password saved in the workflow. And you also need to remember that KNIME, it has a great way so that you can basically store also intermediate results. So if you have an executed workflow and you store it, it's stored with all of the data, right? Which is awesome because you can always go back to in time when you save the workflow and see exactly at each step what the data looks like. But of course, there could be also confidential data, and if you then share that executed saved workflow with a colleague, then he can see also all of the data, right? So there are pros and cons to this storing of the data. So if you share the workflow with confidential data, reset it and store it again, maybe under another name. And then handling credentials, so the proposed way from us is using these credential configuration nodes, which don't save the password, but prompt you then, for example, if you open a workflow that contains this credential configuration node, then it prompts you to enter the password, and you can use them also in components. And it's very easy to use them in the connector nodes. Just select this credential option, and then you will see the name of the credential, like you defined it in the credential configuration node, and then you can select it there, and then it will be used in the node. We also have dedicated connector nodes for the cloud providers like Amazon and Microsoft, for example. And there it's a bit different because there you get a session token usually. And the session token expires after a certain time, so you need to store it if you want to reuse it. And there also make sure, I mean, the session token is like a password, even though it expires, so you don't want to share that with anybody else. So also avoid saving that in the node, only if you have a very good reason to do that. So usually if you use that node only once, then you say that the token should be kept in memory, because then as soon as you close the workflow and shut down KNIME, then the password is gone. It's only in this session then. And if you want to use scheduled workflow execution, for example, with these tokens, or you reuse that very often. You can store that also on your local this file, so you can store these tokens in a file, but then you need to make sure that only you have access, or the people that should have access to this session token have access to this file then. And also usually when you connect to these systems, they allow you to specify the scope basically with the services that you want to work with. Use as narrow a scope as possible there also, just to make it hard to do then bad things in your name, so to speak. Okay, this workflow is already pretty nice because it uses this credential configuration node instead of putting these hard-coded into the connector node, for example. And we also use this cloud resource connector there, and it stores it in a file instead of in the node itself. And maybe one remark there, so we are also working right now on a central credential and configuration store for the KNIME Hub that makes this even easier then. And if you're interested in that, please come to me, and then I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. Yeah, and with that,
the most exciting part.
We hope you have paid attention.
Now it's the test, right? So we will do, no, just kidding. If you don't know the answers, Tobias needs to answer. So we will see if he was listening to me today.
Okay, there are enough people to answer it.
Let's see. Okay, so this is the workflow. And there are a few things that could be done better. I want to get one per person. So if you raise a hand, if you see one, just start with the first one.
Unnecessary note for backup.
We have a mic.
Oh, wait, we need a micro, so for the audience online. So you mentioned already that they get a T-shirt, right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
There's an unnecessary note for having stored an old workflow as a backup, and that should not be executed anymore. It takes time.
You need this? You mean
Yes.
this node? Okay.
I think
That should be removed.
Meta node.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the first one. Okay.
I think Manuel has earned a T-shirt, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
You will get a T-shirt, Mario.
My daughter asked me.
So we will remember who is answering. Then we meet in the wardrobe. I have the T-shirts there.
So somebody else here on the left is.
There's a group by after the database reader. You should do it as a database operation.
Exactly. Another one? It's number 2.
Yeah, there on the left is also one.
The recent updates are read twice.
Those 2?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, maybe we should concentrate, sorry for the right side, from my point, but I think we should also look at the left side. There are lots of hands up here. So who has a microphone on this side here?
Hello. Hi, I'm here.
Toby.
In the right. Yeah.
On the right again.
No, you're left. You're left.
It's so.
Here.
My right is over there. Yeah, over there. There. Okay, now we see it. It's
so
really
I can
bright.
speak.
Yeah.
I'm not sure like if the basically question was answered, but we can see first of all like the nodes which are already sort of like not in use. The database table select like the legacy nodes which we just talked. We need to be like DB node.
Legacy is already a good answer. Yes. So we should turn this into. Thank you.
Hello. Here
So-
in your left.
It's
and
your
here on
chance.
the right. Here.
Yeah.
Over there. Okay, awesome. Thanks for waving. It's really hard to see you.
So
You should take sunglasses.
you
next
have a
time.
table reader within the loop, and this is read every time in every iteration of the loop. So this is wasting time for nothing. So it's better to have a kind of connection between the table reader and with a variable connection and the first loop node, so that it is executed. You force it to be executed before the beginning of the loop start, and then that's forever. And if this loop is looping millions of times, you don't execute the table reader.
This one.
Yeah, the table reader. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, one more maybe. Yeah.
So decision tree learner has nothing after it, so I think it's not necessary.
That's true. And the decision tree learner is even in a loop.
Did you get your question?
I hope there are not too many rounds of the loop, because every time they would calculate a machine learning model.
Do we have more T-shirts or more questions?
Yeah. Last one. A last one.
Yeah, the table readers, they have the plain file path of the user in it, and if this is the configuration, it should be a mount point or something. So if you want to share it, then
if he shares it with Tim, even there's one letter difference, it won't
even
find
Tom.
it.
Tom, it's your workflow.
Tom and Tim.
so
Good that you are here today, and so not to use local paths. Okay,
That's it. Yeah.
I think that's.
We have one more here.
One more.
You have even more ideas.
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
there is another one. So you've got such a wonderful piece of software as KNIME, and then you do at the end Excel writer. No.
It's only for the legacy systems. Okay, I think we can.
Hi.
Okay.
I guess you can also remove the backup in the meta node. I'm not sure if it.
We had it already.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I think it's okay. You can
It's
still
okay.
get the T-shirt.
It's okay.
Yeah. I hope we have enough. Yeah.
Yeah, we have.
Okay, cool. I think we should keep some time for questions also. So I think we should move on now.
That were the answers, but you had even more. So
So we switch.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
And with this, we have also, almost forgot. We have also some more, if you want to read more about best practices, we are writing a lot of blog posts. If you like our blog posts, there's a collection. The slides will be shared, right? So you can also have a look at a bit more best practices there. And with this, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you both for all those wonderful tips and tricks. And also, I'm very impressed with the audience. I think they got more answers than I would have had. So, well done, all of you as well. And now, though, I will be taking questions. Well, I won't be taking them, but I will ask them to our wonderful speakers here. So do we have any questions? I am seeing a hand up right there. Can we get them a microphone?
Philip?
Thank you. Is it possible to get these faulty workflows to download? Would be a good training initiative, right?
That's a nice idea.
Some of our students can find the errors as well.
I think we have an example workflow. I don't know if it's one of those from the slides, but we have for sure an example workflow.
I hope we flag it to be really, really bad. But yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
Thanks.
I just have a question. When you use components, is there maybe a guideline for, is it better to use a component or to create a workflow and call the workflow to do that specific task?
That's a good question that I can't answer right away because it really depends on the use case, how large how many nodes there are, what it is used for, I guess. And I mean, sharing components with this linked sharing is, but you can also update nodes and then use workflows and use the call workflow node. Yeah, I would think, so I would think about it, how often it is used, how much, how large it is, kind of, how many nodes are in there and so on. I think it's just tough to give a general suggestion there. Do you have any better idea? No. Sorry.
I would have another question. Okay. Up here.
Up here is right then? Or?
You're right.
Okay. Yep.
We were able to see what a workflow looks like that is, well, not refined, and then the other version that was refined. And we were able to answer that probably because we saw a pattern. So would it be possible to put this pattern recognition also in the code?
Yeah, that's a really cool idea, and we had already one working on that. We do once a year, we do a nice retreat with the whole company where we try to think out of the box, and we looked into that a bit. But that was only a prototype, so to speak. So he looked into pushing the row filter forward and these kind of things, right? So you could do that, but in the end, we didn't come up with that many rules. Or I need to talk to Mark in detail why in the end it was abandoned. But yeah, we are also thinking about other ways to optimize this, but I don't want to tell too much about that because it's still in the early stage, let's say.
Okay, thank you.
You have a question here?
So,
yes, also.
Okay. Okay,
You have one there?
Ask, what are the best practices for credentials on the KNIME web server? So you tell me now I should store them anyway. But if I have an API key for instance, a weather API or something, and I want to provide this service on a web server, what would be there the best practice?
So with web server, you mean KNIME server then? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, on the KNIME server, yeah, I would suggest then if it's an API key or something like this, then there is no way around that kind of to use then a file and making sure that the permissions of the file are set correctly, so that only the people that should be able to use that API key can read that file and then use the content of this file in the workflow then. And as I mentioned already, for the KNIME Hub, we have something like this central credential configuration store, which we are working on, and this will make that much easier because there will be one secure place where this is stored, and then in the workflows you can reference this one secure place, and you can also tell then which people are allowed to use that. And they can use it without seeing it in plain text, so that's much more secure. But I don't, yeah. If you want to know more, let me know. Maybe you should take one from the online audience and then
Yeah,
stop.
we can take one from the online audience, but then this does have to be the last question. I'm very sorry, but don't worry. They're still going to be here, so you can catch them in the break. But from the online audience, we have, if I have large memory, does it mean the batchway is almost the same speed as streaming?
No, the streaming will still be faster, I would say, yeah. Bernd can contradict me, but I think the streaming should still be faster because, because the nodes can already start executing and working on that while the first one is still in the process, let's say. So that's why I think it will be faster than having them one after the other. Yeah.
And Bernd is here in the background. He's right, because it's often you need to iterate the data, but as you have more memory, obviously, generally the performance improves. And to answer the question on when to use components, or Alison, can I answer that other question that was left out?
Because it's you, Bernd.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Just this one time, but don't get used to it.
Yes. Thank you. So when to use a component, when to use a workflow service, I mean, it's where do you want your computation to take place. Component is run in the workflow, a workflow service is run remote. And that's also, for instance, something that you can use to hide the computation and the actual execution from the client that's running the service. Alison, I'm going to give it back to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And thanks you,
Ben.
Martyna and Tobias, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you all for your questions as well. It was great. So thank you.
Thank you very much.